You're standing in dry grass at the edge of a forest clearing, and 40 feet away, a coyote has stopped mid-stride to look at you. Not glance. Look. Its ears are forward, its weight is settled back on its haunches, and for 3 full seconds, neither of you moves. There's no fence between you, no gun in your hand, no radio, no backup, no plan. There's just your body, standing upright, soft-skinned, slow, and an animal that has spent its entire life reading exactly what a threat looks like. No claws, no fangs, no fur thick enough to matter. Nothing about your body should by any rational measure be intimidating to a wild predator built to run down deer twice its size. And in that moment, a question opens up that most people never let themselves ask. What does it actually see when it looks at you? Not a human in the abstract cultural sense we use, the way we picture ourselves at the top of some imaginary food chain. Something more animal than that. Something closer to a calculation running behind 2 amber eyes, weighing what you are against everything it has ever learned about creatures that stand upright. Because here's the real question this video is going to answer. Do wild animals see us as dangerous the way they'd see a bear or a wolf? Or do they see something else entirely? Something softer, slower, easier? Something worth testing, the way a predator tests a wounded animal at the edge of a herd? Here's the thing nobody tells you. The answer isn't fear, not straightforwardly and not universally. Decades of field research on everything from deer to magpies to elephants have converged on something stranger and a lot more uncomfortable than a simple yes or no. Many wild animals don't file humans under predator the way they file wolves or big cats as one fixed, unchanging category. They file us under variable, a mixed signal, a species that is sometimes catastrophically lethal and sometimes completely irrelevant, and the only way to know which one you're dealing with right now in this clearing is to test it. That single fact rewires the whole conversation, because a fixed fear response is inherited, hardwired, automatic, the kind of thing a baby gazelle does the first time it smells a lion, no learning required. A variable response, one that gets tested, updated, and adjusted encounter by encounter, generation by generation, is something closer to judgment. And judgment implies an animal is actively assessing you, gathering evidence, weighing probabilities, not just fleeing on reflex, evaluating. Here's where it gets interesting, and where most nature documentaries stop asking questions too early. If animals are running a real-time risk assessment on humans instead of a blanket fear reflex, then the question, do they see us as weak, isn't really about our physical strength at all. It's about what we telegraph, our posture, our gaze, our pace, our history in that specific patch of ground, and the history of every human who walked through it before us. An animal in a national park and an animal in a hunting zone are behaviorally looking at 2 different species, even though both are looking at the exact same features: 2 legs, forward-facing eyes, a slow and clumsy gait. And this instinct to test, to read, to calibrate risk around an unfamiliar upright animal, that almost certainly predates humans as a species entirely. The architecture for it is ancient. Prey animals have been running threat assessment routines on unfamiliar bipedal shapes moving through their territory since long before Homo sapiens existed, back through earlier hominins, back through whatever primate ancestors were already being hunted by and occasionally hunting animals far larger than themselves. The specific target changed over millions of years. The wiring that decides flee, freeze, or stay and watch did not. Some researchers trace the basic machinery of vigilance and risk scaling in prey mammals back tens of millions of years, long before anything resembling a human ever cast a shadow across a clearing. What you're triggering in that coyote isn't a response built for you specifically as a species. It's a response built for anything on 2 legs that might mean death, running on hardware old enough to have watched 1,000 different predators come and go, rise to dominance, and vanish. You are, biologically speaking, just the latest thing to walk into a very patient surveillance system. And that surveillance system is better than most people assume. It's not crude pattern matching, the equivalent of a smoke alarm that only knows smoke or no smoke. Elephants can pick out the specific ethnic group of a human being from nothing but the sound of a few spoken words. Deer flee human voices harder than they flee an actual predator standing in the open. Monkeys can tell the difference between a person who's hunting them and a person who's simply passing through. None of that is instinct in the simple sense. It's memory, inference, and something close to culture running inside brains we've spent centuries assuming were too small to hold at any of it. So the animal on the other end of your stare in that clearing has no idea and no reason to care that you consider yourself the most advanced species on the planet, sitting comfortably at the top of some imagined hierarchy. It only cares about one thing: what happens next? And the answer it reaches, the one it's reaching right now behind those still, unblinking eyes, is built from a body of evidence far older and far stranger than anything we usually give wild animals credit for.
Let's start with the clearest evidence. Animals don't just fear humans, they fear us more than almost anything else in the ecosystem. A body of research led by ecologists Liana Zanet and Michael Clinchy looked at how prey species respond to the mere sound of humans talking, walking, or coughing near them. No weapons, no chase, just human noise, and compared it to their response to actual apex predators like lions and wolves. The animals didn't relax around the human sounds. In several of these studies, mammals fled from recordings of casual human voices faster and more consistently than they fled from the growls and roars of predators that could genuinely kill them. Sit with that for a second. A grazing deer, a badger, a leopard, species that have coexisted with actual lions for their entire evolutionary history, will bolt harder from a stranger clearing their throat on a trail than from the animal biologically built to end their life. Researchers have started calling humans the super predator, and it's not a poetic flourish. It's a term backed by flight response data across dozens of species and continents. Fear doesn't care how you look, it cares what you've done before. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because if humans were simply the scariest thing in the forest, that would be a short video. It isn't. There's a second layer underneath the fear data, and it comes from studies on animals that live specifically in landscapes with mixed human intent, places where some people hunt and some people just walk through. A study on wild woolly monkeys in Ecuador's Yosemite National Park put this to a direct test. Researchers had human actors approach monkey troops while performing one of three behaviors: hunting, gathering, or simply observing. In areas with heavy hunting pressure, the monkeys reacted differently depending on which behavior the human displayed, reserving their most extreme alarm calls in evasive movement for the hunting behavior specifically, not for humans in general. In low hunting pressure areas, that distinction blurred. The monkeys, in other words, weren't just afraid of humans, they were reading humans, sorting behavior into categories of threat with something that looks a lot like situational judgment. That's not blind fear, that's risk profiling. Now, let's talk about the animal that takes this the furthest, because it's not a primate and it's not even a predator's typical prey, it's the elephant. Researchers Karen McComb and Graham Shannon, working with the Amboseli Trust for Elephants in Kenya, ran a series of playback experiments on wild elephant families, broadcasting recorded human voices through hidden speakers and filming how the herds reacted. Some of the voices belong to Maasai men, a group whose young men have traditionally speared elephants as a display of courage. Others belong to Kamba men, farmers with a far less confrontational history with elephants living nearby. The animals didn't just react to the presence of a human voice, they reacted to which human voice. Hearing Maasai men, the herds bunched together defensively and raised their trunks to smell the air far more often than when they heard Kamba men saying the exact same sentence. And the discrimination went deeper still. The same Maasai words, spoken by a woman or a boy instead of a man, produced a noticeably calmer response, because women and boys in that culture rarely take part in spearing elephants. The animals weren't reacting to a species, they were reacting to a demographic extracted entirely from a few seconds of unfamiliar speech in a language they don't speak. That is not an animal that sees humans as one undifferentiated threat. That's an animal running something close to a background check. There's another angle to this that rarely comes up, and it has nothing to do with what we say or do. It's about where we look. A study on wild magpies found that birds being approached by a human assessed the threat significantly faster when the human was looking directly at the bird, compared when the human's gaze was angled away. The magpie wasn't just tracking distance or speed, it was reading eye contact as data, the exact same cue a rabbit reads off a fox and a gazelle reads off a cheetah at the exact moment the chase decision gets made. Which, if you want the deadpan version, means every wildlife photographer who's ever whispered, "Don't make eye contact, you'll spook it," while a squirrel calmly ignored a foot-tall lens pointed directly at its face, was technically correct about the science and wrong about the squirrel. And this brings us to the sharpest evidence yet: research on ungulates in a hunting-prohibited reserve in North China, where scientists played recordings of human voices, leopard growls, and neutral wind sounds to wild roe deer and boar. The deer and boar fled from the human voices at rates equal to, and in some cases higher than, their flight response to an actual apex predator sharing their ecosystem. This was in a protected area. Nobody had hunted these animals in years. The fear wasn't current experience, it was inherited or learned generationally, and it outlasted the actual danger by a wide margin. So by the end of this chapter, one thing should be clear: animals don't uniformly see humans as weak, and they don't uniformly see us devastating either. What they've built across species is different as monkeys, elephants, magpies, deer, and wild boar, is something closer to a live threat assessment system, one that updates based on posture, gaze, sound, culture, and history. Which means the real question isn't whether animals fear us, it's what exactly they're using to decide.
Let's tackle the biggest myth about this whole topic: the idea that fear and respect are the same thing, and that an animal fleeing from you is proof it sees you as dangerous. It's not that simple, and the deeper mechanism underneath it is where this gets genuinely uncomfortable. Fear in prey species isn't really about strength at all, it's about unpredictability. Ecologists call it the landscape of fear, a term developed by researchers Joel Brown and William Laundrie to describe how prey animals mentally map out risk across a territory, not based on how strong a predator is in a fair fight, but based on how unpredictable and inescapable an encounter with it tends to be. A lion is enormously strong, but it hunts in patterns animals have evolved to read and often evade. A human with a rifle can kill from 400 yards away, in silence, with no warning at all. Strength has nothing to do with why that's terrifying. Unpredictability does. That's the deeper mechanism. Animals aren't ranking us by muscle, they're ranking us by how much warning we give before we become lethal, and by how little we resemble any threat our bodies were originally built to detect. This is where the habituation research gets genuinely strange. Daniel Blumstein and others have documented that animals in low-hunting, high-human traffic areas, urban parks, protected reserves, tourist zones, steadily lose their flight response to humans, sometimes within a handful of generations. Deer that would have bolted from a human silhouette a century ago will now graze 20 feet from a jogging path. That's not animals concluding humans are strong or weak, it's animals running a cost-benefit calculation and concluding, correctly, that in this specific place, we're statistically irrelevant to their survival. Now, stack the numbers, because this is where it stops being abstract. In hunted populations, researchers have recorded flight initiation distances, the gap at which an animal starts fleeing an approaching human, of well over 100 meters for large ungulates.
In habituated, low-hunting urban populations, that same species might let a human approach to within 5 or 10 meters before reacting at all. That's roughly a 20-fold difference in perceived danger in the same species, driven entirely by regional human behavior. Some studies on hunted versus protected bird populations show comparably steep gaps, birds in hunting zones flushing at 2 to 3 times the distance of birds in reserves just a few kilometers away. And in the elephant research, the swing was just as sharp. Defensive bunching roughly doubled in response to the voices most associated with historical spearing compared to voices belonging to a group with no such history, even though both were speaking the exact same sentence. Same species, same body, same eyes and ears taking in the exact same information, wildly different verdict on what we are. So the myth isn't just wrong, it's backwards. Animals aren't reading our physical weakness or strength, they're reading our track record and doing it with a precision that would embarrass most human eyewitnesses. And there are real exceptions that complicate this further, cases where the normal rule breaks down entirely. Urban coyotes in cities like Chicago and Denver have, in documented cases, grown bold enough to approach pets, strollers, and even isolated pedestrians, not because they've concluded humans are prey, but because repeated feeding, intentional or accidental through unsecured trash and handouts, collapsed the danger signal altogether and replaced it with something closer to association. Human proximity now predicts food, not risk. Wildlife agencies in several U.S. cities have had to actively haze habituated coyote populations, deliberately reintroducing fear through aggressive human behavior, specifically because the animals had stopped reading humans as anything worth avoiding. There's a second exception worth naming, and it cuts the other way. In parts of Africa where elephant poaching has been severe, herds have been documented becoming more aggressive towards humans generally, not less, expanding their definition of dangerous human outward until almost any unfamiliar person on foot triggers a defensive response. That's the mirror image of the coyote story. One population lost its fear because the danger disappeared, the other lost its ability to discriminate because the danger became so constant and so severe that caution stopped being worth the risk of getting it wrong. That's the caveat worth sitting with. Fear of humans isn't fixed, and it isn't innate in the way we assume. It's a maintained belief, and like any belief built on evidence, it can be unlearned when the evidence stops arriving or overgeneralized when the evidence becomes too frequent and too brutal to sort carefully. We don't know exactly how many generations a population's ancestral wariness fully erodes or fully calcifies in a given species, and we probably never will with precision. The timeline seems to vary enormously by species, region, and how consistently the danger changes, but the direction is consistent everywhere it's been studied. Change the consequence, and the fear reorganizes around it, sometimes within a single generation. Which raises the harder question underneath all of this. If an animal's read on us is just a running tally of consequences, sorted by demographic, by behavior, by sound, and by history, then what we've built, collectively, as a species, is the consequence, and that's a very different story than wild animals are naturally afraid of us. Here's where we arrive at the uncomfortable part, because everything in the last chapter points to one conclusion that's easy to miss. The fear, or fearlessness, an animal shows you isn't really about you, the individual, standing in a clearing. It's a verdict on your species' collective behavior, compiled over generations in that specific place. You inherit a reputation you never personally earned, and depending on where you're standing, that reputation is either working violently in your favor or quietly getting you closer to something that doesn't respect you at all. Let's be honest about something else too. The landscape of fear we've been describing, this map of danger animals carry in their heads, isn't an ancient relic from a wilder past. We built most of it, and we're still building it, just at industrial scale now. A wolf population that's been hunted for 2 generations reads humans as lethal. A wolf population that's been protected for 2 generations starts approaching campsites. The fear isn't a fact about wolves, it's a live readout of how humans, right now, this decade, in this region, are actually behaving. Every hunting season, every cull, every well-meaning feeding station in a national park is quietly rewriting an animal's threat assessment of our entire species, whether we intended to or not. And it happens at an industrial scale most people never picture. Modern hunting doesn't just remove individual animals from a population, it reshapes the cytology of everything left behind. Entire regional populations of deer, elk, and boar have measurably shifted their flight distances, their nocturnal activity, and their habitat use in direct response to the intensity of a single hunting season, sometimes reverting only part way even after protections are restored years later. We talk about hunting pressure like it's a wildlife management statistic. To the animals living inside it, it's a generational trauma being passed down the same way a matriarch elephant passes down the memory of a spearing to a calf that never witnessed it firsthand. And this is the through line that connects back to something much closer to home than a forest clearing. We do the exact same threat calibration to each other. You size up a stranger on an empty street the same way that coyote sized you up, the same way that elephants sized up a stranger's voice, not by their muscle mass, but by posture, pace, eye contact, tone, unpredictability. Every mugging, every kind stranger, every viral video of a bystander helping or hurting someone is quietly recalibrating a collective sense of who's dangerous and who isn't. Generation over generation, exactly like a deer population learning to trust or not trust a hiking trail. The mechanism prey animals use on us is the same mechanism we use on each other. We just don't usually call it that, and we rarely admit how much of it we inherited rather than reasoned our way into. There's a version of this that should genuinely unsettle you. If elephants can sort human ethnic groups from threat level from a few spoken words, then somewhere in the quiet architecture of every prey species that's ever coexisted with us, there is a version of us being profiled, categorized, remembered, and passed down through generations who will never personally meet us. We built that reputation one interaction at a time, across centuries, without ever once being in the room to explain ourselves, defend ourselves, or update the record. Which brings us back to that clearing. You're still standing there, the coyote is still watching. 3 seconds have passed, maybe 4, and what's actually happening in that gap isn't fear, and it isn't disrespect. It's an animal running the same calculation its ancestors ran on wolves, on bears, on every large, unpredictable shape that ever walked into their territory, updated in real time by everything humans in this specific place have done before you ever arrived. The coyote breaks eye contact first. It turns, unhurried, and disappears into the tree line, not because it's afraid of you and not because it thinks you're weak, but because for now, in this place, you didn't give it a reason to decide either way. Somewhere behind those eyes, a small piece of evidence just got filed away, added to a ledger that started accumulating long before you were born, and that will keep accumulating long after you've forgotten this clearing ever existed. We were never being judged for our strength, we were being judged for our history.